So session two, we're gonna do the second part of what I thought we would cover last week. Kind of walk us through the outline, and then we'll get to it. And then I'm gonna, in a few moments, I'm gonna invite you folks to share a little bit. So I'm gonna just plant the seed because we're gonna talk about the Torah this week. So I'll be interested if anyone is willing to share. I'll be interested to hear people just talk about their relationship with the Torah, what the Torah means to them, has meant to them. And by the Torah, I mean, sometimes Torah is used to mean something very vast. I mean very specifically the Torah. I mean the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim. That book, I'm interested in talking about that book because, as you know, the subtitle, and we're going to parse the subtitle in this class, the subtitle is Rereading the Torah as a Spiritual Handbook. So while I'm just kind of introducing things, you can start to, it's okay, I don't mind if you're not paying full attention to this part. You can just start to think about, what is, you can ask yourself the question, what is my relationship with that document, that book, that artifact, that object, and what does it mean to me? So I'm hoping folks will feel brave and share a little bit. But for now, let's just kind of talk about where we're going. So this is the title of the course. This is what I imagine we'll cover today, but who knows? We may cover less. I'm certain we won't cover more. That's for sure. So we'll do a quick summary of last week's session. Then we'll do a bit of a deep dive on the subtitle of the course, Rereading the Torah as a Spiritual Handbook. We're going to talk about the Torah. We're going to talk about reading the Torah, and then we're going to talk about spiritual handbooks. What do I mean by these things? And then if we have time, we'll do practice 0. Remember, this is about practice. We're going to talk about that throughout the course. And so either today or next week, we'll do practice 0. And by practice 0, I mean simply it's the foundational practice. It's the practice of all practices. And it's one that you're familiar with, but maybe I'll present it in a way that's fresh. And if not, then a reminder will work just fine. So that's the plan. Let's just do the summary. So last time we talked about practicing, and I shared some definitions in brief. Why should we practice? Why would we practice? Simply because we want to habituate certain ways of being, and we want to cultivate skillfulness. That's what I'm proposing. I remember I think last week I quoted Sylvia Boorstein. At the first time I spoke with her, we spoke on the phone. It was during COVID, actually. We spoke on the phone, and she had just celebrated, or was just about to celebrate, her 85th birthday. And I said to her, what are you reflecting on? And she said, well, I've been thinking about my life's work. And it occurs to me that my life's work has been trying to help people to habituate their mind to a more compassionate response. So right there, habituating your mind to a more compassionate response. There's habituation, because the word habituate is in there, and it's also skillful, right? The compassionate response is a skillful use of the mind. So we want to practice because we want to habituate certain ways of being, and we want to cultivate skill. And I'm not a believer, and maybe it's just because I'm not old enough yet, but I'm hoping you'll agree with me. I'm not a believer in that old saying about old dogs and new tricks. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I think that if we're willing to engage in practice, we can cultivate skill in new ways at any stage of our lives. In fact, maybe in some ways that may be a definition of what it is to be alive. So that's the first thing, why practice. Then we talked about why practice Judaism, very simply, wake up, do good. It's not to say there aren't other benefits from practicing Judaism. There are many benefits, gastronomic, social, intellectual, many benefits, But ultimately, Judaism, like any other wisdom or spiritual or religious tradition, at its best, is interested in waking up, right? Do you remember that verse from Genesis, right? Vayikatz Yaakov mishnato, Jacob awoke from his slumber, right? And he said, Chen yesh Adonai b'makom hazeh, right? It's truly Adonai is in this place. So he woke up, and then now you're awake. The way you know you're awake is, do you know what is expected of you? And that's the second. Do good, do good. So why practice Judaism? Wake up, do good. And if Judaism is not helping you achieve those two things, try something else. Some things work for some people, other things work for other people. That's fine. This is not a subscription program. I'm not selling memberships. I'm not even a salesman for Judaism. I'm a salesman for waking up and doing good, and I think Judaism can help people do that. But I understand that its market share, and accept that. So that's the second piece we covered last week. And then finally, what's so special about the 21st century? In a word, oi. Oi, a big oi. We don't need to go into that whole thing again, but it's bad and it's going to get worse. So the importance of being awake and doing good is maybe heightened, not only in relation to the extent of the oi, but also, frankly, in terms of our own capacity to be resilient in the face of what's taking place. So that's kind of what we covered last time, and now we'll move to the subtitle: Rereading the Torah as a Spiritual Handbook. So let's just take another 60 seconds. I'll stop talking and give you a chance to revisit those questions. What does the Torah mean to me, and what is my relationship to the Torah? And then as someone, if you feel moved, unmute yourself, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. Well, thanks for starting us off, Aglaia. Aglaia wrote, the Torah made me change my mind about religion. Gosh, I want to hear more about that. So you can either type in the chat or we'll just wait till next week with bated breath when you're hopefully feeling better.
I can talk a little bit, but I used to think of it as religion as opiate of the masses. And then Torah made me change my mind about that.
So that it's not an opiate, or that it's not for the masses, or both?
Religion, I stopped thinking of it as the opiate of the masses.
Can you say, just one more question. Can you say a little bit about how you think about it now because of your encounter with the Torah?
I noticed that it solves a lot of problems for me, and when I'm not actually even expecting, in a lot of weird ways that I'm not expecting. Yeah, I'll read something from the Torah, and the next thing I know, I have the answer to a life question that I really was not expecting.
Amen. Isn't that something? Okay, so then let me just not to put words in your mouth, but what I heard you saying is that the Torah is to use actually the words you used. It's a problem-solving device for you in some ways, unexpectedly.
Mm-hmm, yes.
Unexpectedly. Well, that's kind of magical, and I use that word in its most positive sense. Someone else. Thanks, Aglaia.
The Torah and I have a personal relationship. It's described in our prayers as keneged, and so I accept that. And each time I read the cycle of it in the commentary, and often a new commentary, which has been really important to me in my studies, something else comes up. It's continually revealing ideas and and even instructions that guide my life and reinforce it. So that's how I feel about it.
Thank you. You said keneged, but you didn't translate it. How would you translate that?
To be compared to, in contrast to, that's how. It's like a reflection. It's like a relationship between husband and wife. You learn from each other. You grow together. So the Torah is way ahead of me, but I still learn from it. The continued revelation is spectacular.
Okay, so it's like an instruction manual, a guide. Thanks. Stan wrote, the Torah is a guidepost for life, but only if accompanied with Talmud and Gemara. Okay. So for you, Stan, it needs this additional layer to serve in that role. Mm-hmm. Yes, is it Steve? Is that a hand up?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I see it a little bit differently. All of my life, I have felt the need and desire to be good. However, I cannot for the life of me recall anybody ever telling me that, be good, do good things. I think the desire to do good is innate. You look at a little baby, and all of a sudden it starts chortling and laughing hysterically. And those pictures of little kids giggling, let's say 3 months old, 4 months old, is their simplistic way of being good, doing good. So because I believe doing good is innate, I think Torah is wake up and don't do bad, as opposed to wake up and do good. I think goodness is innate.
Lovely. So a reminder, a wake-up call, something like that. Yeah.
Yes.
Lovely.
Yes.
Lovely. Thanks for that. Ronnie, were you going to go?
Sure. I love what everybody is saying about the opening and waking up and awareness and just having the Torah, being among the Torah, I think gives us that. But I also really love that no matter where we are and we go into a synagogue, we know there's a Torah. We know there could be multiple Torahs, and they all have their own story where they came from, just like we do. So not only do I connect with the stories, but I connect almost physically as like a human source of education in that Arona Kodesh. So yeah, I think
Very
it's
nice.
an interesting question for sure.
Thanks for that. Tell me, hopefully I'm not putting words in your mouth either, but what I heard was the sense of familiarity, which is something like you see an old friend.
Yes, like an old friend that you know is going to be there anytime you go visit.
Love that.
We don't have that in any other. So yeah.
Beautiful.
Yes, we do.
Oh, we do. Okay. Well, maybe Ronnie doesn't, but maybe you do, Judith. Let's hear what you want to say.
Doing good is certainly not limited to people who are capable of reading the Torah or even reading. An animal can do good. When my German Shepherd years ago, if a baby was coming near her, she would turn her paw so that the baby would only reach the soft side and not get hurt. And most animals, cats, dogs, even birds, can offer solace. They know when their person is not happy or is having a problem, and they just offer it may be a mute understanding, it may be a physical understanding, but it is certainly capable of giving aid, help, comfort, and they certainly don't read anything, much less the Torah.
So thank you for that. So tell me about what the Torah is for you, Judith.
It's another piece of me. It's part of me.
Oh.
It's part of my lifestyle. It's part of how I interact with others.
Lovely.
And they may not have ever heard of the Torah.
Uh-huh.
Since my contacts are not limited to Orthodox jewelry or any kind of jewelry.
Uh-huh. Thanks for that. This is lovely, isn't it? I don't know about
It's-
you, but
it's
everyone
lovely.
else have this
It
nice
is
warm
lovely.
feeling.
It's lovely seeing you again.
It's
And
nice to see you, Judith. It's a real pleasure.
And since the Torah is the study, the Torah is part of why we are all seeing each other again. So that in itself is good.
Oh, thank you for that. So the Torah as convener, right? It brings people together. Also beautiful. Okay. Any others? Hannah.
So I've been sitting here looking at what's special about the 21st century Oi.
Okay.
And I think that I'm looking to what is in the Torah that's going to make things better, because right now
Mhm.
I have a lot of fear about what life is going to be like. And I'm hoping the Torah reveals something that will make that better.
Thank you.
I will say this, I've moved to a lot of different cities.
Mm.
And the one thing that I have found in each one is a Jewish community. And it has been the help that I've needed when I was a stranger in a strange place. So for me, the Torah brings us back to being Jewish. And
Lovely.
that's
Lovely.
whatever.
And I love that. And the first thing you said, about the Oi, it seems like you were saying that you hope the Torah is a balm in some way, BALM, balm, like like it somehow helps us with our anxiety, with our worry. So I think that's also right. Eitz Chaim Hila Machazikim Ba, right? It's the tree of life to those who hold fast to it. So there's some idea of holding on to it, Thank you, Hannah. Catherine, you have a hand up.
Yeah, it's I think one of the reasons I took this course, a major reason, is how to utilize it in the 21st century. This past week with the fires and with Trump and with all the craziness going on in Ukraine, how can I be a source of good? I've used it in the old century, but I'm a little lost right now. So I wandered in here thinking, well, how are you people doing that? How are you putting it into action or making it better? Thank you.
Thanks. I appreciate you sharing that. And so for folks who feel lost, can the Torah be a kind of a map? Can it help us find our way back to a place where we feel found? We don't have that feeling of being lost. Very rich. Just take a moment to kind of appreciate all these things that we've heard. And of course, the Torah is all of these things. It's not all of them for everyone, but it's all of these things. And even though it's an object, I have copies on my shelf, and we see it in the Ark in the synagogue. It's also this very mysterious thing that it has these multiple facets and multiple meanings. If it's okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the Torah means for me and how I've kind of thought about it and my relationship with it, so I can add my piece. An unusual, I don't know if it's unusual, but it feels unusual to me, maybe because it's not similar to anything else in my life. My relationship with the Torah is not similar to anything in my life. And the origins of my relationship with it are somewhat mysterious. I'm going to show you a picture here. You can see this picture here. So there's two pictures here. So the picture on the left, which I'm holding a copy of it here. The picture on the left is a certificate that comes from Chabad. Chabad Lubavitch. The Hasidim that are in every town, right? And the certificate says, up here it says, Be'ezrat Hashem Yitbarach, with the help of God, the blessed God. Ve'al ktivat sefer Torah avur Yaldei Yisrael, and based on for the writing of sefer Torah for the children of Israel. Al Yedei Vad Rabbanei Chabad Be'eretz HaKodesh, by the hands of the leadership of Chabad in the land of Israel, in Kfar Chabad. There's a town in Israel called Kfar Chabad, the city of Chabad, where Chabad people live. So this is like a certificate, right? That we have the certificate. It says Teuda, certifies, or certificate. This is a certificate. V'zot l'teuda ki, and this certifies that. And you see there's a name. It says Kleinberg Darren. Kleinberg Darren. So I'm Darren Kleinberg. They misspelled my first name, but that's fine. This certifies that Darren Kleinberg kana ot b'sefer Torah shel Yaldei Yisrael has purchased a letter in the Torah scroll of the children of Israel. Hanichtav Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, that was written in Jerusalem, the holy city, Ir Shechuvrala, the city that was destroyed and then rebuilt, etc., etc. In the month of Sivan, in the year Tafshin Mem Aleph. Tafshin Mem Aleph is Sivan. Tafshin Mem Aleph is June 1981. June 1981. Va'al Begorala, and according to a lot, at random, oh, the letter is in the book of Shemot, is in the book of Exodus, in Parshat Beshalach, in the Parsha of Beshalach. Beshalach is the third parsha in the book of Exodus, but Shemot, Bo B'Shalach, second or third parsha, and it's the parsha of the Jewish people coming out of the land of Egypt, the Exodus from Egypt. So this is a certificate. So I've had this certificate in my possession for as long as I remember, and a few years ago, I said to my parents. I said, where did we get this? I said, where did it come from? And my parents have no recollection. By the way, in 1981, I was 5 years old. So I was born in 1976. I said to my parents, where did we get this? And my parents have no recollection. They don't even believe that I have it, because, I mean, they saw it, of course, but they have no recollection of it ever happening. And my family has no, certainly at that stage in my life, in our family's life, had no involvement in the organized Jewish community, weren't members of synagogues, didn't participate, didn't go for high holiday. I mean, didn't do anything with Jewish life. But when I was 5 years old, somehow a letter was written in a scroll in Jerusalem on my behalf. And that's uncanny. I find that's something, again, I've been aware of that my whole life. And in some ways, I feel like that act, which I believe was an act of generosity and care by somebody, when I was 5 years old, has had this kind of guiding influence on my life. And so since then, 42 years ago, I've been intertwined with the Torah. It just has been significant in my life. I started to go to Jewish day school when I was 11 years old in England, which is unusual in America. Usually if you grow up in an unreligious home, you don't always end up going to a day school. It's less common here. But in England, it happens more often. And I went to day school. I started taking Jewish studies classes at age 11. And I remember my first Jewish studies teacher, Hannah Hertz. She came from kind of the old world of Judaism. She wore a shaitel and was always dressed modestly and always kind of sang the class. She would sing it in that sing-song, that Jewish sing-song voice, and something about what was going on in that class captivated me. And she essentially introduced me to the world of Torah study. At 13, I had a bar mitzvah, like a lot of people. Although maybe not like a lot of people, ever since that day, I felt like my bar mitzvah parsha was like a constellation. And actually, I actually recommend people, here's a recommendation. If you know what your bar or your bat mitzvah parsha was, or even if you didn't have a bar or bat mitzvah, you can figure it out. You know, you can search it based on your birthday. You could take a look at that parsha and you could think about, you know, how does this parsha tell me something about my life? So I read Parshat Noach. I read the story of Noah, which, by the way, is uncommon in the Jewish world. If you think about it, right? It's the first Shabbat after the high holidays. Most synagogues, right? Remember, most synagogues are not Orthodox synagogues, right? In the Orthodox community, you have your bar mitzvah on the date of your bar mitzvah. But in many non-Orthodox communities, which are the majority, the b'nai mitzvahs are scheduled. So most rabbis don't want to have a bar mitzvah the week after Simchat Torah, because they've been working really hard for the last month and they don't want to have another one to do. So it's unusual that people have the parsha of Noach as their bar mitzvah parsha. And it's, of course, an unusual parsha in the Torah because it's one of only 3 that isn't about Jews, right? Bereshit is not about Jews, the first parsha in the Torah. Noach is not about Jews, and Parshat Balak in the book of Numbers is not about Jews. So I imagine that in some way that had a role to play in my universal orientation. You know, that I was bar mitzvahed on a parsha that was about human beings. And the line of that reading that has been present in my mind since I read it on the bima on the day of my bar mitzvah was the description of Noach. Ela toldot Noach ish tzadik tamim haya bedoratav et ha'elohim hitalech Noach. Right. This is the story of Noach. Noach was a simple, righteous person in his generation. He walked very closely with God. And it's just been clear to me ever since then, sometimes less clear than others. I'll say it's clear to me now, that that's all that's asked of us. Simple, righteous, walking closely with God. That's all we have to do in life. That's all we have to do. And I've spent most of my life trying to figure out what that might look like, how one might live into that description. Tzaddik tamim haya b'dorotav, simple, righteous in your generation, right? Et ha'elohim hitalech Noach, walking especially close with God. So the Torah was kind of a strong part, formative part of my my early years. And then later in life, I went, after high school, I spent 8 of the 10 years after high school in seminary, which when it was happening and for 10 or 15 years after, never occurred to me as being unusual, but I now realize that's pretty unusual to go from high school to seminary and then spend 8 out of the next 10 years there. And I was captivated not only by the Torah, but by the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. I found that to be very engaging, even though in Orthodox seminaries where I was studying, most of the attention is on Talmud, not on Torah. And I remember once going to the head of the yeshiva, the head of the seminary, and I said to him, I said, why do we spend so much time studying Talmud? Isn't the tradition that the Torah was given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai? I mean, shouldn't we be paying more attention to that? And he said to me, oh, you just have to read the Talmud and it will tell you which are the important parts of the Torah. And I'll tell you, immediately when he said it, I knew he was wrong, which is quite more humbly, I would say I disagreed with him, but I think he was wrong. I don't need to go to war with him over it. I just disagree, and I think that's incorrect. I think the Torah not only stands on by itself, but needs to be encountered by itself. It would be like trying to learn to get to know another person by asking a third person about them, right? This is not how we come to know something intimately. So even when I was in seminary, I knew that I was drawn to the Torah, and then after that, starting actually towards the end of my time in seminary when I was studying to be a rabbi, I then moved from kind of more traditional ways of studying Torah, which I appreciated and learned a lot about, and then started to engage in the kind of academic study of Torah. You know, the history, the archaeology, the philology, the language, just trying to understand the world in which the Torah was produced. And then the last thing I want to share, and then we'll get to some text, is this other picture here on the right. And then I'll move to the content. So during COVID, you know, a lot of people took up new skills. The people I know became expert bakers. They made sourdough, you know, as well as you could possibly imagine. I learned more about sourdough starters than I even knew you could learn. And that's great. And I really appreciated enjoying their sourdough bread and learning about the things that folks were doing. But I did something different. I was in December of 2020, when it was really in the, you know, the deep, dark part of COVID. I was crossing the street from my house to go to the supermarket. And I don't know how else to describe it. Maybe, you know, in the rabbinic tradition, there's this thing called a bat kol. You know, it's like a heavenly voice. And there are these stories about people hearing heavenly voices. So I have to be careful. If I say I heard a heavenly voice, you'll wonder if my head's screwed on correctly. But here it is. I was crossing the street, and I was in the parking lot of the supermarket across the street. And as clear as day, I don't want to say I heard, because it wasn't auditory, but as clear as day in my mind, I understood that I had to write the Torah. You may know there's a tradition that there are 613 commandments in the Torah, 613 mitzvot. And we're going to come back to this a little bit later, but the last of the 613, according to most counts, the last is the commandment to write yourself a Torah. It's a commandment. And the verse just appeared in my mind. And actually, as I'm thinking about it now, and I remember it, I was like an automaton, but an automaton for the mystery. I didn't make it into the supermarket. I turned around. I walked back to my house. I found a hardback journal and a fine-tipped Sharpie, and I began to copy. And over 6 months, I copied the Torah from the first word to the last word. And this here is a picture of one of the pages. There's the Sharpie. Here's the journal. Thanks. It revealed things that I didn't know were possible to be revealed about a book, and about a time, and about a place, and about history. And what I'll say, the last thing I'll say is, and maybe this is more playful than serious, but I think I was writing it right there in the beginning. I think of myself, some part of myself, I don't know which part of it, being I don't know, somehow got reincarnated in this body, that one of the scribes that was sitting there in the 5th century or the 4th century before the Common Era. I feel like that's part of my inheritance in terms of my relationship with this document. So I'm deeply intertwined with it, and it's had a formative role in my life also. And so when I say, you know, the subtitle is Rereading the Torah as a Spiritual Handbook, you know, that gives you a sense of how I'm coming to this conversation, you know, what my orientation is in coming to this. So let's look at some ideas. So what I want to do is, first I want to start and say, you know, some of you might be listening and thinking like, boy, maybe the people that didn't speak, I don't know, but I don't really know what all these people are talking about. I don't have a relationship with the Torah. So what I want to start off by saying is that's fine too. One doesn't have to be engaged deeply or even not deeply with the Torah to be a a terrible phrase to be a good Jew. That's not required. It's not required at all. In fact, one could be a Jew completely adjacent to the world of Torah, and of course, many people are. So I just want to start with one kind of historical observation to make this point, because I don't want to sound like an ideologue for the Torah. That's not the case at all. You know, just because I love my wife doesn't mean I need you to love her too, right? Same thing. So that's what I want to be clear about. So there's this wonderful a book that I read last year about the Jews of Elephantine. So maybe you know about Elephantine. It's this tiny little island in the Nile in the southeastern part of Egypt. I mean, it's tiny. It's like 4,000 feet by 1,200 feet. It's tiny, but people lived on the island. And there was a Jewish community there. So on this book by the kind of leading scholar of the Jews of Elephantine, he writes that Elephantine in the 4th to 5th centuries BCE, 2,500 years ago, it was possible to be a Jew and a polytheist. Yes, it was possible to be a Jew and have your own temple far away from Jerusalem. It was possible to be a Jew, marry an Egyptian wife, and still have Jewish children. It was possible to be a Jew and never read the Torah because there was as yet no Torah. It was possible to be a Jew and never read the Torah because there was as yet no Torah. Right? That seems important to me, that being Jewish precedes the Torah. Right? That seems important to me. To anyone who hears it, the story of the Elephantine community is a reminder of the fact that the story of the Jews has many chapters. To believe that every chapter tells the same story in a slightly different way would be a big mistake. There are vast differences across time and space. And in some ways, you know, some people said the Torah is like a problem-solving device for them. Some talked about it as a convener. Some talked about it as a balm. You know, for any of the things that people said, if anyone else doesn't have that relationship to the Torah, then they're also a kind of a Jew before that Torah has come into being. You understand? Because that version of the Torah hasn't come into being for them. And so I just after we've all shared these things, you know, I want to be very clear about this, that let me tell a little story that may illustrate it. You know, I should preface the story by saying it's a story that can be misinterpreted as a kind of Buddhist triumphalist story. I don't mean it that way at all. I like to tell the story mostly because it makes me smile, but I think the point is an interesting one. So the story goes like this. You know, there's a rabbi goes to see a Zen monk in his town. Of course, the Zen monk is Jewish, of course, and the rabbi shows up at the zendo, and he says to the Zen monk, who's you know, before he took on his Buddhist name, his name was Shlomo. So the rabbi says, Shlomo, look, I understand meditation is very nice. Meditation's nice. Jews, we have meditation too. It's very nice. You know, I understand, but what's with all these idols? So Shlomo, the Zen monk, Shlomo says to the rabbi, what do you mean idols? So the rabbi says, well, you know, all these statues of the Buddha that you have around, right? So the Zen monk picks one up. He says, what, you mean these? And the rabbi says, yeah, what do you have all these? I mean, meditation's one thing, but you have to keep all these idols around. So then the Zen monk opens the window and throws the statue out the window, and it crashes into pieces on the ground. And the monk says to the rabbi, now do that with your Torah. Right, so it's a bit of a harsh story, right? I'm not recommending anyone throw the Torah out the window, but I do think sometimes that the document can be idolized. In fact, if you didn't know anything and you walked into a synagogue, you might think that it's an idol. I mean, just take a moment, step outside of your own familiar experience and just think about what happens. You know, everybody stands up and there's a curtain and there's singing, and then we bring it out. People are kissing it and they're following it around. You know, it can be idolized. And what I want to say is the Torah, although this idea does exist in certain parts of the Jewish tradition, the Torah is not God. The Torah is the Torah, you know, or you could even say it this way. The Torah is God, but only part of God, not the whole God, right? In the same way that like each of us is part of God, but not the whole God, right? And so I'm sharing that story, and I'm sharing this little thing about the Jews of Elephantine because I want to make it absolutely clear, despite all the things that we said and the things that I shared, it's an extraordinary book, and it's an extraordinary book it's extraordinary, that has power and influence in ways that are hard to understand, and it's a book, and we have to be careful, I think, about that. So okay, so these days I'm interested in, and this is what the next few slides are going to be about. I'm interested in, I used to be interested in when I was in my, when I was like in school, junior school and high school. I think I was just interested in trying to understand like what's going on here. It was so foreign to me. I just didn't know what was going on. When I went to seminary, I was interested in like understanding the words. You read interpretations and try to figure out like what's the deeper meaning. And as I've kind of moved in my journey, in my relationship with the Torah, there's a different question has kind of informed my study. And the question has been, most recently, has been, what would the people who wrote this book have to have known to have written it? Right. So not what does the text mean, not what the words mean, how can I mine it for wisdom, although all those things are certainly important. But for me, the primary question is, what would I'm interested in the person behind the text. What would the person or the people who wrote this, what would they have to know? What would have to be true in terms of their experience to have produced this document? Maybe another way of saying it is, what is the world in which this document came into being? That's interesting to me. It's probably interesting to me on some part because, I'm moving through the middle years of my life, and I probably spent some time in recent years thinking about what was the world that I came into that played a formative role in the person that I was for some period of my life. So I imagine that question is kind of refracted through my own life experience, but that's the question. And so what I'm going to show you in the next few slides is just a little bit of the world in which I'm fairly convinced the Torah came into being. And it comes from the same scholar who wrote about the Jews of Elephantine. But before he wrote about the Jews of Elephantine, he wrote about the culture of the scribal community that produced the Torah. Okay? So he writes, first, the flourishing of scribal culture that produced the Hebrew Bible occurred in Judah, or Judea, in the Second Temple period, more specifically the Persian and the Hellenistic eras, circa 500 to 200 BCE. Okay, so this is interesting because this is after the destruction of the temple, right? There's a temple standing, a Jewish Israelite, not Jewish really, that wasn't the word, an Israelite temple. It's standing in Jerusalem. It was built sometime around 1000 BCE and is destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians, right? The traditional view is the Torah, the traditional Orthodox, inherited classical view, is that the Torah was written sometime in the 11th or 12th century BCE, right? And that the events described in the Torah give us a sense of when these events occurred. That is universally, from a scholarly perspective, rejected. And the preponderance of scholarship says no. In fact, it was actually produced after the destruction of the temple, 586 BCE. So we have to understand a little bit about that, right? So first of all, the destruction of the temple is a kind of a Holocaust scale event in Israelite history, right? Josephus estimates 1 million Israelites were murdered during the Babylonian siege and destruction of Jerusalem and taking over of the land of Israel, right? The central cultic institution, the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed, right? I mean, you have to just take a second and think about the impact. Well, we know, right? We're living 80 years after the Holocaust. We know the defining impact and the trauma of an event like that and the effect it has on people, right? So that's the foundation for the world in which the Torah came into being. 586, by the way, also, there's a massive exile, right? The Israelites are exiled from the land, yes? And it takes another 2 or 3 generations before the Israelites start to return to the land of Israel, right? Under the Persian Empire, under King Cyrus. They come back in the late 6th century BCE, start to rebuild the Second Temple, right? Second Temple's rebuilt sometime 500, 515 BCE. So it's after this period of destruction, right, that the Torah comes into being. Under foreign rule, right? Israelites are no longer sovereign in the land of Israel. There's no monarchy anymore. The monarchy has been destroyed, right? They're living under foreign rule. It's an occupation, yes? The Israelites are living in occupied territories under Persian rule and then under Hellenistic rule, okay? That's number one. Number two, in the Persian era, Judaism developed into a religion of the book. In the Persian era, Judaism developed into a religion of the book, that book being the Torah of Moses, and ultimately, by extension, the Hebrew Bible as a whole. The impetus for this development was the Hellenistic era, when books and libraries became the symbol of a nation's cultural capital, right? We all know about the Library of Alexandria, right? But you have to understand what's being said here, that the importance of a book, the value of a book, came from a different culture. It was not, to use a word that may be anachronistic, it was not indigenous to Israelites, right? It was not an indigenous value. It was an external value that came into favor in the context of Persian and then Hellenistic rule. That's significant. Okay, 3. The laws of Moses received canonical status under the impetus of the Persian authorities. Check this out. In their dealings with conquered nations, the Persians sought to provide their rule with a solid base by sanctioning the codified law of the land as the law of the Persian king. Those nations that did not possess a national law were urged to create one. Okay, simple terms. The Persians were known as being fairly kind, fairly generous empire, benevolent, because they allowed the nations that they ruled to have a level of independence. But the deal was, if you're going to be somewhat independent, you need to have a constitution. Persian Empire said, we need to know that you're going to have a kind of a structure and an order to your society. And so they set that expectation. That created the conditions not only to write a book, but to write a book like, as Spinoza correctly identified already in the 17th century, served as a kind of domestic constitution for the Israelites who would return to the land of Israel, right? So the value of the book and the value of law. And if you remember, you know, the Torah it's many things, but it's primarily, you could say, or at least significantly, a law code. There's a lot of laws in there, a lot of civic laws, right? Torts, damages, you know, and so that also comes from the outside. And here the author is explicitly clear. Without the Persians, there would not have been a Pentateuch. The Persians are responsible too for the transformation of the Torah into the law. The context that gave rise to the production of the Torah was a Persian context, okay? The elevation of that document into a law code was a function of the demands of the Persian Empire. Last point I want to make here, scribal education in the Persian period was in the hands of the Levites. This is very important, right? After the destruction of the first temple, when the Israelites come back to Israel, there's no monarchy anymore, right? There's no monarchy. So who's at the top of the Israelite pyramid? The priests. Right? The priests are at the top, not the prophets. That, you know, that era is past, right? No more kings. The priests are at the top. Okay. And the priests have a kind of scribal academy that they run. And the scribal academy, they're called Levitical scribes. The scribal academy is where this work of producing the Torah and then the Hebrew Bible came into being. So this is significant, right? I'm going to boil this down into very simplified terms, right? what this means is that the context in which the Torah came into being, one was the echo, the trauma of destruction, right? I mean, it's already now, by the 5th century, mid-5th century, it's already 150 years since the destruction of the temple. But we know 80 years after, I just got an email yesterday, Jewish Family and Children's Services in San Francisco is building a Holocaust center, right? Jews don't forget so quickly, right? So if 80 years after we're still remembering the Holocaust, it's likely that 100, 150 years after the destruction of the temple, they still remembered the effects of that trauma, right? There's no doubt that it had a defining impact on them. Second, we know the context is one of imperialism, right? External powers, right? Informing the culture, essentially, producing a kind of syncretistic, synthetic cultural experience in which whatever indigenous Israelite life might have looked like for the previous 500 years, it's now undergoing a transformation as a result of its interaction with this imperial culture. And the third piece, and this is critical, is the negotiation of power. You see, the priests are at the top of the pyramid, right? But they're only at the top of the Israelite pyramid. The priests are second to the Persian Empire, yes? And the production of the Torah is essentially a document that negotiates the power relationship between the Persian Empire and then the Hellenistic Empire and the Israelites, right? How do we know this? For example, Ezra, there's a book in the Hebrew Bible called Ezra, right? Ezra most likely was the head of the Scribal Academy. He led the process of producing these documents, right? What was one of Ezra's other jobs? He was the liaison between the Israelite community and the Persian Empire, right? He was the go-between, you see. And so the production of this book was not, we shouldn't kid ourselves. The production of this book was not some kind of pure, abstracted, spiritual or mystical, piece of art. That's in there too. But it, in very real historical and human terms, served in a role of power negotiation between an imperial power and a group of people who have gone through a pretty extraordinarily traumatic experience in the past 3, 4, 5, 6 generations. I'll just say now, sidebar, when I kind of did all this reading, it made a lot of sense to me, but it made more sense to me because, and you can take this or leave it, when I was writing that book, when I was copying the Torah, I did one chapter a day. I copied one chapter a day. It took about 6 months. Of the many things that happened while I was copying it, was this a very clear, and sometimes startlingly so, very clear sense of the pathos of the book. You've had this experience. I mean, you've listened to pieces of music, or you've looked at pieces of art, or you've read certain books. I recently, after Harold Kushner died, Rabbi Harold Kushner, he wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People, yeah. So after he died, I thought I would read the book again, just, as an appreciation. And, if you read that book slowly enough and attentively enough, there's no mistaking. You can feel the emotional tenor of what's going on in that book, the pathos of this man dealing with the tragic death of his 14-year-old son, right? You can feel it in the words. It's in there. So I'm telling you that writing the Torah one chapter a day, this context is very apparent. It's very apparent. And by the way, apparent in ways that you may miss it. If you sit in synagogue and you hear someone quickly reading through, a long section of the text, and also in ways that you may miss it if you engage in a kind of word by word, close exegetical reading of the text, okay? So I want to say that's the context, right? And, but here's the beauty, and I want to pause. This is in some ways always the context, you see, right? If you're fortunate to have made it to adulthood and you're awake, then you know that this is always going on. I mean, can you open the New York Times and not see all of this playing out? Of Of course you can. This is what's always going on. What's extraordinary, among other things, about the Torah is in the midst of all these things that are happening, there is extraordinary wisdom. There is extraordinary wisdom. In fact, there may even be greater wisdom, right? I mean, it's those of us that have lived through the hardship that then can look back and learn something from it and then pass it along. So what I want to say is that the history, which may be a yawner for some people, sometimes listening to the history is not as exciting, but I think the history gives us a sense of the context in which, the reality in which the Torah came into being, and maybe the reason why its wisdom, at least maybe one of the reasons why its wisdom is so deep, because it was produced in that cauldron of the century or century and a half after that destruction. So I want to pause there. How did that land with folks? Let's get a couple of comments and then we'll pause until next week. Okay, Aglaya, yay, historian. I love that you dig it. That's great. Judith.
That early reading of the Torah would not be, they would not accept you today as you are today by those people who mailed you that or sent you that or even taught you in those early years, because they are so much at an extreme point now. The Torah it's still accepted. It is more accepted. The people of the Torah now are the Torah is more accepting of them than the early people were of those that are reading it now.
Well, I'll just say this.
Extremism is a cult.
Well, I'll just say this. We're all coming along at our own pace. On some level, it doesn't really matter to me how someone thinks about the Torah. What matters to me is how they act. So I don't need someone to affirm what I just said about the historical origins of the document. If it's important to them to believe that it was dictated by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, and they still treat people with kindness, then that's okay with me. Of course, the problem is in the other direction when people treat people unkindly or worse, and then they claim that their justification is some document or other. But there's no shortage of folks like that in the world. So that's incumbent upon us to try to shift the balance a little bit. But I appreciate what you said, Judith.
There is no shortage of people who believe only one thing.
Fair enough.
But their treatment of the others is not very often very tolerant. It's my way or the highway.
What do you think the first scroll was?
Well, that's a lovely question. I mean, we do have we have words and verses that are more ancient than the 5th and 4th century. We have they found a curse. They found one of the curses. that goes back a long way.
Priestly blessing.
Yeah, there's some priestly blessing, and also even the folks who have this kind of post-destruction view of when the Torah came into being as the Torah. There is some sense that maybe Deuteronomy, sections of Psalms, and some other sections predated the destruction, but they were used as kind of textbooks in the scribal academy. They were used as copying documents. So there's some sense of that. So this is not to say that there's nothing that predates the destruction, but what is that? And we'll say more about this next week. But what this does suggest is that there is and I'll follow this up with another comment, that there was a historical necessity, or we might be more cynical, a political necessity to write these stories in this way, And my point is one that actually that perspective allows us to understand it more deeply in the same way as just understanding how any person is the way they are and recognizing the truth of the exigencies that gave rise to the type of person they are. And that yet, even within such a historical or political context, great wisdom can be produced. The analogy I would give, which is so obvious, is that, read the American Constitution, right? The fingerprints of the moment in history in which it was written are very clear. And there are things in there that, that make some of us feel quite uncomfortable. And yet there is some wisdom present in that document. It can be found. But that's, in the pantheon of documents, the Constitution is a whippersnapper compared to the Torah. The Torah has, and brings with it the additional wisdom of having traveled all of that time in that space. So, yeah, so I think you said what was the first?
Yeah.
We don't know what the first was, but it's kind of tragic that the earliest words from the Torah that we have archaeologically may actually be from one of the curses. It's kind of tragic.
Yeah, but Darren,
yeah.
It had to have some preceding oral tradition. I mean, the question was what got woven together in particular ways. But there are obviously some of the stories, some of the myths, some of the laws existed orally. And it was a question of how and when they got woven together. The amazing point is the one you make, that the wisdom that's within it, when you put aside all the repetitive stuff, and it is pretty astounding. But it didn't just come out of nowhere. I don't mean to suggest it came from God, not my thing, but there was a preceding oral tradition of some sort.
Yeah, there's no doubt.
Yes.
And interestingly, a lot of that likely came from other cultures other than the Israelite culture, of course.
Yes.
So of course, this course about rereading the Torah. So the simple point here is that the Torah as we know it did come into being at a moment in time, or over a period of time. It's true, it had antecedents, and it had but it came in the context that necessitated it coming into being can be with a fair amount of confidence, can be located in time and in history. And what I'm suggesting is and that context is significant if we're going to try to develop a different way, another way of reading or rereading that text. And now I feel like like it's like a TV show. And to find out more about that, you'll have to come back next week. Lovely to see everybody. We didn't even make it to the end of the first section, so this is fine. We'll get to spiritual handbooks and rereading next week. And Alex, thanks so much for your help. Bye, everybody. See you next week.